There are usually three questions that friends and family ask when returning from Israel. Where did you go? So what is really going on over there? And then lastly, was it a good trip? 6 months ago, 19 of us left for Israel. And this morning, I want to share some highlights from the trip, focusing on those three questions. Where did you go? In the first few days, we walked through so many places so quickly that there were running bets on our bus as to how little time our tour guide, Mookie, would give us to shop. He kept telling us that we were there to learn and not to be tourists. And learn we did. One of our first stops was here at the newly named Museum of the Jewish People. For those who have been to Israel in the past, this is what was called the Diaspora Museum. Upon entering this museum, we looked up at the ceiling and saw this replica of the Chodorau Synagogue of Ukraine. And Mookie focused in on one part. This is how the Jews of Ukraine imagined Jerusalem to be. You might notice that the pillars right in the center look Eastern European. It's important to know that unlike us, these Jews never got to go to Israel, but they certainly dreamt about it and imagined it. I think that it's powerful that this is the entrance to the museum, because it shows, to me anyway, that Israel and the diaspora help to not only strengthen one another, but to define one another. This is the remains of the ancient city of Caesarea, and interestingly enough, still functions as an actual amphitheater with concerts from time to time. It was built by Herod the Great around 25 BCE. As you might guess, Herod and the Romans used this amphitheater to host gladiator battles. In fact, there's a debate in the Talmud about whether or not Jews were allowed to attend these violent matches. Sitting on these historic steps, we had a debate in the style of the Talmud about that very question. Rav Marcy Simon gave one opinion, and Rav Ken Sherman gave another. Incidentally, if you want to know what the actual ruling is, please feel free to ask me after the holidays. It's perfectly Talmudic. But our mock debate pointed to something crucial about Jewish identity. Like those Jews 2,000 years ago, we too have to try and make sense of Judaism and the modern world. Sometimes one is a priority over the other, and sometimes, thankfully, they are not in conflict at all. But regardless, the decision to live a Jewish life must be intentional. Speaking of modernity, we took a graffiti tour and came across many modern interpretations that blended art with traditional Jewish text. I found this piece particularly striking. The Hebrew verse is sometimes called the most important mitzvah in our Torah. V'ahavta l'reach kamocha. Love your neighbor as yourself. The picture above shows two Orthodox men kissing. The artist confronts us with the fact that there are sometimes inconsistencies in our religion between our ideals that we proclaim and the system of mitzvot that we go by. I could go on and on. We went to the Western Wall and placed over 100 prayers that many of you wrote in the months prior to our trip. We learned about the historical significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls and saw them. We celebrated Purim in Tel Aviv and overlooked Jerusalem just as the sun was going down. We toured Sfat and learned about the beginning of a new kind of Judaism, mystical Judaism, otherwise known as Kabbalah. The second question, what is really going on over there? We went to an artist's colony in Ein Hod and saw this installation. It is a chessboard with all the pieces captured except for each king. And if you look closer, you can see that the game has come to a stalemate, with no side being able to claim victory, but both in some ways claiming loss. This was the artist's interpretation of Israel's continued conflicts. And many of Israel's conflicts, like America, are domestic. Part of the complexity lies in the fact that in Israel, there are three major axes of political discussion and, yes, discord: Israel's economy, Israel's security, and religion, meaning how does Jewish law play into Israeli law or not? You may find yourself allied with your neighbor on the economy, for example, but disagree vehemently with regard to security, and so on. This helps to explain why Israel currently has over 20 political parties represented in its Knesset. And I thought America's system was complicated. I've preached before about Israel's unfair treatment of religiously liberal Jews. And this is one axis of Israeli life that I encourage and in fact implore you to become involved in. The Israel Religious Action Center, the IRAC, is making great strides to provide rights and equality for non-Orthodox Judaism. And there are other organizations in Israel that are doing their part to create peace. We traveled to an organization called Sidyana, which provides employment and social support to Arab and Israeli women. They work together to make olive oil, za'atar, and other wonderful products. In fact, Jewish-Arab coexistence is one of their 5 founding principles, and we could taste the shalom and love that they put into their products. They even taught us how to make our own za'atar. We had lunch at the home of a Druze family, and our host, pictured next to me, standing up in the back of the table, he shared with us about his life and his opinions on the current situation, as they call it, hamatzav, the situation in Israel. We saw that it is possible to both love Israel fiercely while also understanding the plight of the Palestinian people. So the answer to the question, what's going on over there, is that it's complicated. But for someone who has been to Israel and who has learned from Israelis, Arab and Jewish, and gotten some different perspectives, there's a bit more nuance to the answer. It is complicated, but let me tell you what I saw and learned. And so I invite you to ask this question to any of the participants on our trip. And as you know, the situation changes all the time, making things even more complicated. Just in the last month, a diplomatic pact was agreed upon between Israel, Bahrain, and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. Time will, of course, tell whether this is a meaningful step toward peace. But regardless, we continue to pray for the safety of Israel and its citizens. The last question, just perhaps the most difficult to answer. Was the trip good? Undoubtedly, yes, but in the spirit of all other things Israel, it's complicated. The beginning of our trip was bittersweet, as several participants made the difficult decision to stay in Athens due to concerns surrounding the then novel coronavirus. And I hope I'm not embarrassing her, but once we landed, Betty Emke sustained a fairly severe injury, and much credit and koach goes to her for remaining positive during the trip and enjoying it to the best of her ability, as well as to all of us on the trip who helped support her through some of those difficult days. We indeed became very bonded through this trip. In an unbelievable confluence of circumstance, or just plain bad luck, The Israeli government decided to limit public gatherings to 100 people, then 50, and then 10, all during the time we were there. Flights got canceled, rebooked, and canceled again. And the last few days of our itinerary were essentially canceled. We called ourselves the last tourists in Israel, and we certainly felt the stress and fear of the pandemic, especially with loved ones back here in America. But the pandemic also gave us a unique glimpse into Israeli life. During a gorgeous morning early on in our trip, we took jeeps to an overlook on the Golan Heights. As we were driving, our driver just incidentally told us that that same morning, the chief rabbi of Israel was going in a helicopter along with a shofar so that he could blast Corona away. I don't think it worked. This photo encapsulates our trip to Israel, and it's in context with what I just said and what follows. We were supposed to have a special Shabbat experience in Jerusalem, starting with a song session and followed by services at a well-known Reformed congregation, Kol HaNeshama. On Wednesday or Thursday morning, we knew that that was not going to happen. And on Friday afternoon, just 1 hour before Shabbat started, I was told that our beloved tour guide, who we had all bonded so closely with, Mookie, would not be with us for any more of the trip, as his son was sick and Mookie was legally obligated to quarantine himself. His son is fine, it was a cold. We got together then for our Shabbat service in the room of the hotel. We didn't have prayer books or a song leader or the gorgeous vista of the Israeli sunset. So what we did was we talked and shared our feelings and some of our frustrations and celebrated Shabbat. The next morning is when this picture was taken, and we met our new tour guide, Uri. He brought us a challah that his wife had made, and we all shared a bit of it. At this point in the trip, as I've shared, many of us did not have confirmed flights back. We actually didn't even know if the hotel was going to let us stay there. Thankfully, they did, and things were starting to look scary back home. But for me, and I think several of us, this was in some ways the highlight of our trip. Because even with its frustration, sadness, and apprehension, even with the unfortunate circumstances surrounding us, we were a Jewish community that celebrated Shabbat. And we did it with smiles, challah, and wine. Our trip started 10 days prior with the awe, joy, and interest of Jewish history. We had a very full itinerary, but 10 days later, when we reflected on the trip, we realized that we had full hearts as well. Yes, we learned a ton, as Mookie and Uri would be proud of us for doing, and we took a lot of pictures and ate unique food and all the rest that goes into any special trip. But this was not a vacation. It was a trip home. We strengthened our ties to Israel, understanding some of the many complexities of Israeli society and its conflicts with some of its neighbors. And more importantly, we became closer with one another. I hope that someday all of us can go to Israel safely together. I pray so fervently for an end to these socially distant times and the difficult realities of our current lives. But in the meantime, it is both our blessing and our obligation to celebrate the blessings of our lives with wine, challah, and friendship. L'shana tova. We'll take just a few moments for silent reflection.